The funeral was supposed to be the end of my brother's toxic legacy, but when the solicitor opened our mother's final testament, it became clear that she hadn't left us an inheritance. She had left us a death warrant. Minutes later, the Service of Internal Security smashed through the doors, and I realized my family's house was built on a foundation of secrets that were now coming to bury me alive. My brother Julian was a ghost in the narrative of our family. He didn't exist for birthdays, he didn't exist for funerals, and he certainly didn't exist when our mother's health began its slow, cruel decline 2 years ago. While I was scrubbing floors, paying for private nurses, and navigating the labyrinth of insurance policies, Julian was a whisper, a name mentioned only in hushed, bitter tones by our mother when the painkillers made her lose her grip on reality. I had forgotten the sound of his laugh and the specific, arrogant tilt of his head. I had resigned myself to being the only child left to bury the woman who gave us life, but the universe, it seems, has a twisted sense of humor regarding inheritance. The funeral was a muted affair, a scattering of distant relatives, a few neighbors who felt obligated to show up, and the relentless, suffocating scent of lilies. I stood by the graveside, my hands trembling as the cold rain began to soak through my coat. I wasn't grieving as much as I was exhausted. I was hollowed out by the 2 years of hospice care that had drained my savings and my sanity. Then I saw him. He arrived in a sleek charcoal gray sedan that looked entirely too expensive for the muddy cemetery path. He stepped out, draped in a black trench coat that appeared to cost more than my entire year's salary. He didn't run to hug me. He didn't even look at the coffin. He stood at the edge of the crowd, checking his watch with an air of practiced impatience, his eyes scanning the mourners like a predator assessing a herd. When our eyes met, there was no softening of his expression, just a sharp, clinical nod that made my skin crawl. Julian hadn't come to mourn. He had come to collect. 3 days later, we were in the office of our mother's solicitor, Mr. Henderson, a man whose skin was as papery and wrinkled as the legal documents he cradled. The air in the room was thick with the smell of old mahogany and judgment. I sat in one of the hardback chairs, staring at my hands, while Julian leaned back in his, swirling an imaginary glass of scotch, his presence dominating the cramped space. He hadn't asked about me once, not about my health, not about the medical bills, not about the night our mother finally let go. "Thank you both for being here," Henderson began, clearing his throat. "Your mother was a woman of foresight. She drafted this testament 6 months ago, once her condition became terminal." Julian leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a predatory intensity. "Cut the preamble, Henderson. We know why we're here. Let's see what the old lady left behind." I felt a surge of nausea. "She wasn't the old lady, Julian. She was your mother." He turned his gaze toward me, and it was cold, empty, and devoid of any human empathy. "She was a woman who made bad investments, Sarah. Let's see if she at least had the decency to keep the house out of the red." Henderson adjusted his glasses and unfolded a thick, yellowing document. He began to read, his voice droning on through clauses of standard property divisions and minor heirlooms. Most of it was noise, the china, the paintings, the dusty jewelry that held more sentimental value than market price. But then Henderson stopped. His face went pale. He flipped to the back of the document, his eyes widening as he read a paragraph that hadn't been there during our initial consultation. "Is there a problem?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Henderson looked up at us, his hand shaking slightly as he set the paper down on the desk. "It seems..." It seems your mother added a codicil here, a very specific, very dangerous directive. Julian's smile vanished. What kind of directive? Henderson didn't answer immediately. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a heavy, tarnished silver key that didn't belong to any lock I recognized. He pushed it across the table toward Julian, but before he could say a word, the heavy oak door to the office burst open. Standing there were two men in dark, nondescript suits, not lawyers, not family friends, and certainly not police officers. They held themselves with the tension of people who were accustomed to using violence to solve their problems. One of them held up a badge that looked official, but it wasn't the local precinct's insignia. It was the mark of the Service of Internal Security. "Julian Thorne?" the man in the front asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Julian's bravado shattered in an instant. He went deathly pale, his hands clenching into fists beneath the table. "I have no idea who you're talking about," he stammered, his eyes darting toward the window. "We have a warrant," the man continued, stepping further into the room, his eyes locking onto mine, then drifting to the silver key sitting on the desk. "We've been tracking a specific illegal organization for months, Julian, and it seems that while your mother was dying, she was keeping a very detailed record of your activities. You aren't just here for an inheritance. You're here because you've been caught in a web of forbidden dealings, and your mother made sure that everything you tried to hide is now sitting right in front of us." The room went silent save for the hum of the air conditioner. My stomach dropped through the floor. I looked at Julian, seeing the raw terror in his eyes for the first time, and then I looked at the key. It wasn't just a key to a safe deposit box. It was the key to a nightmare. "Open it," the agent commanded, nodding toward the safe built into the office wall, "and pray that what's inside is enough to keep you from facing an enormous sentence for your involvement in that illicit network." As I watched, Julian reached for the wall safe, his hand trembling so violently that the key clattered against the metal plate. He turned it, the mechanism clicked, and the heavy door groaned open, revealing not money, but a mountain of files and a small, heavy box that made the agent's expressions turn from stern to lethal. And then I saw it, the flash of something metallic and prohibited tucked behind the files. Julian hadn't just abandoned us. He had brought a war to our doorstep, and the inheritance wasn't an estate. It was a death warrant. The office seemed to shrink as the air grew thin, heavy with the weight of what lay inside that safe. The men in the dark suits didn't move toward the files immediately. They circled the desk like sharks catching the scent of blood in the water. I stood frozen, my back pressed against the mahogany paneling, watching the sequence of events unfold as if I were a ghost, haunting my own life. Julian, the man who had been a ghost to our family for years, was suddenly the centerpiece of a storm I didn't even know was brewing. "Don't touch it," the lead agent warned, his hand resting almost casually on the holster beneath his jacket. His eyes remained locked on the items Julian had pulled into the light. "That box isn't just property, Julian. It's evidence of a sophisticated, organized scheme that we've been trying to dismantle for the better part of a decade. You really thought you could just waltz into your mother's legacy without leaving a trail?" Julian's bravado had completely evaporated. He looked smaller, frail, and desperately human. "I don't know what's in there," he stammered, his voice cracking. "She sent me a letter. She said she had something to give me. I thought it was the deeds to the property in the city. I didn't know anything about those people." The second agent stepped forward, his expression a mask of cold professionalism. He pulled out a pair of metallic restraints, their silver sheen reflecting the dim light of the office. The Service of Internal Security isn't interested in what you thought. We're interested in the contents of that safe. Your mother, despite her illness, spent her final months acting as an informant for our department. She wasn't just observing your downfall, Julian. She was actively orchestrating it. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My mother, the woman who had spent her nights crying over Julian's absence, hadn't been mourning. She had been watching. She had been documenting. The realization was so sharp, it felt like a physical wound. Every time she had asked me to get her notebook, every time she had insisted on being left alone with her financial records, she was stitching together the noose that was now tightening around my brother's neck. Julian turned to me, his eyes wide and pleading. "Sarah, you have to tell them. You were there. You saw her. Did she ever mention me being involved in anything wrong? Tell them she was confused. Tell them she was delirious from the medication." I looked at him, and for the first time I didn't see my brother. I saw a stranger, a man who had chosen a path of destruction and expected the wreckage of his life to be cleaned up by the family he had long ago discarded. I looked down at the desk. Among the files were photos, blurred, grainy shots of Julian at a warehouse I recognized from the outskirts of town, and images of him meeting with men whose faces were etched in my memory from the nightly news. These were the people involved in the circulation of prohibited substances, the people who turned neighborhoods into war zones. "I don't know what you're talking about, Julian," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I took care of Mom. I watched her suffer while you were out building this life. I didn't know you were capable of this. But looking at these files, I don't think I ever really knew you at all." The lead agent stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Julian's shoulder and spinning him around. The sound of the cuffs snapping shut was final, a sharp metallic bite that echoed in the quiet room. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, possession of forbidden substances, and the transport of prohibited items. You're looking at an enormous sentence, and that's assuming you decide to cooperate with our investigation into the rest of your organization." Julian let out a strangled cry as he was dragged toward the door. "Sarah, they're going to kill me. If I talk, they'll kill me before I even reach the station. You have to help me." As they shoved him through the doorway, the agent paused, looking back at me. He dropped a heavy leather-bound ledger onto the desk right next to the silver key. "Ms. Thorne, your brother is going to be processed at the central facility. You might want to leave the building through the back exit. We aren't the only ones who knew about this safe, and those people don't take kindly to loose ends." The door swung shut behind them, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of the lawyer's office. Mr. Henderson was still huddled in the corner, his face pale and his eyes averted. I looked down at the ledger the agent had left behind. My name was written on the inside cover in my mother's elegant, cursive handwriting. I opened the book, my breath hitching in my throat. It wasn't just a ledger of accounts. It was a diary. And the last entry, dated the day before she died, wasn't about her illness or her grief. It was a list of names of powerful people in our town, including our local judge and the police chief, all linked to the same organized scheme Julian had been serving. Suddenly, a loud, heavy thud sounded against the office door. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of a heavy shoulder hitting the wood. Then came the sound of a mechanical lock being forced from the hallway. Someone, or something, was trying to get in, and they were clearly not the authorities. I scrambled to the back of the room, looking for an exit, but the windows were painted shut, the building old and stubborn. The door groaned again, the wood splintering near the deadbolt. I realized then that my mother hadn't just left me an inheritance. She had left me a target. I grabbed the ledger, clutching it to my chest, and ran toward the small storage closet in the back, just as the main office door gave way with a deafening crash, revealing a group of figures in tactical gear who were definitely not the police. They scanned the empty room, their eyes cold and hungry, and then one of them slowly began to walk toward the storage closet door, behind which I was hiding. The closet smelled of dust and decaying legal records, a cramped tomb where I held my breath until my lungs burned. Through the narrow gap in the door, I watched the silhouettes move across the office. They weren't speaking. They moved with the eerie, practiced synchronization of professionals, the kind who didn't leave witnesses. One of them, a man with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw, kicked aside the chair Julian had occupied. He didn't look at the floor. He looked at the open safe, then at the desk where the ledger had been sitting just seconds before. "She's close," the man growled, his voice a gravelly rasp that vibrated through the floorboards. "The ledger isn't here, which means she took it, and if she took it, she knows." "Check the perimeter," another replied. The Service of Internal Security moved fast, but they didn't sweep the back corridor. She couldn't have gone far. I pressed my back against the cool, hard shelving, praying the wood of the closet door wouldn't creak. My hands were shaking so violently that the ledger felt like it might slip from my fingers. I flipped it open one last time, desperate for a map, a name or a way out. My eyes landed on a page marked with a red ink stain. Underneath a series of dates and locations, there was a handwritten note from my mother. "If they find you, go to the cellar of the house. The foundation is hollowed out behind the water heater. It's the only place the network hasn't dared to touch because of what is buried beneath." I stared at the words, my mind reeling. My mother had been living in a house that contained something even these criminals feared? My thoughts were interrupted by the handle of the closet door. It began to turn, slowly, methodically. I didn't think. I acted. I reached for the heavy fire extinguisher mounted on the wall inside the closet. As the door swung open, revealing the scarred man's face, I swung the canister with every ounce of terror-fueled adrenaline I possessed. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening thud. He crumpled, his weapon skittering across the floor toward the center of the office. I didn't wait to see if he was dead. I scrambled over his twitching body, my heart acting like a frantic drum against my ribs, and sprinted for the rear exit. I burst out into the rain-slicked alleyway, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. I didn't look back. I just ran, my heels clicking sharply against the cobblestones. I didn't stop until I reached my car, a battered hatchback that felt like the only sanctuary I had left. The drive to my mother's house was a blur of high speeds and frantic glances in the rearview mirror. I kept expecting headlights to snap on behind me, for a black sedan to cut me off, but the road stayed eerily empty. When I reached the house, it looked exactly as I had left it, a tomb of memories. I fumbled with my keys, my hands covered in dirt and sweat, and stumbled inside. The house was cold, too cold. The silence was absolute, heavier than the silence in the solicitor's office. I walked through the living room, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and headed straight for the basement door. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I descended the stairs into the darkness, the scent of damp earth and rust growing stronger with every step. I found the water heater, a massive, rusted hunk of metal that looked as though it hadn't functioned since the 90s. I shoved it aside, grunting with the effort, until I saw it, a small square panel of loose stone at the base of the foundation. I pried it away, my fingers bleeding as I clawed at the mortar. Behind the stone was a small lead-lined box. I pulled it out, my chest heaving, and opened the lid. Inside, there were no documents. There were no maps. There was a drive, an encrypted communication device, and a single Polaroid photograph of me, taken from inside this very house, just yesterday while I was sleeping in the living room. My blood turned to ice. I wasn't just being hunted. I was being watched from inside my own home. I heard a soft, deliberate footstep on the floorboards above me. Then the sound of a voice, soft, melodic, and terrifyingly familiar, drifted down the stairs. "You really should have left that box where it was, Sarah. Your mother always was too clever for her own good, and you seem to have inherited her unfortunate habit of digging for things that were meant to stay buried." I looked up toward the basement door. Standing at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway, was someone I had trusted my entire life. Someone who, according to the records, should have been hundreds of miles away. As they started down the stairs, moving with a predatory grace, I realized the organized scheme wasn't just a group of strangers. It was a ghost from my own bloodline, and they had just come home to finish the job. The figure descending the stairs was my Uncle Thomas, the same man who had stood at my mother's graveside, whispering condolences and pressing folded bills into my palm as if to bribe me for my silence. He looked different now. The kindly, middle-aged widower with the gentle demeanor was gone. In his place stood a man whose posture was rigid, whose eyes were devoid of any warmth, and who held a suppressed weapon with the familiarity of a career professional. "Thomas?" I choked out, the name tasting like ash. You were the one who helped me organize the funeral. You were there when the hospice nurses left. How could you?" He reached the bottom step, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and stopped. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, as if I were a child who had failed a simple test. "You never understood the nature of this family, Sarah. Your mother liked to play the martyr, pretending she was the victim of circumstance. She spent years acting as a mole for the Internal Security Service, feeding them scraps of information, all while enjoying the lifestyle that our connections provided." He gestured vaguely at the damp, cold basement around us. "She was the architect of her own cage, and now, it seems, she's decided to drag you into it with her. Do you have any idea how many people are looking for that ledger? It's not just a diary, it's a roadmap of the entire organized network in this county. Judges, police commanders, local politicians, everyone who keeps the wheels of our operations turning." "She didn't want this for me," I snapped, clutching the lead-lined box to my chest. "She wanted me out. She told me to leave." "She told you to hide," Thomas corrected, his voice dropping into a dangerous, silky register. "Because she knew I'd be coming. She thought she could outsmart me with a few scribbled notes and a hidden safe. But she forgot one crucial detail. I'm the one who paid for her care. I'm the one who made sure the nurses were discreet. I'm the one who knew exactly where she'd keep her final leverage." I backed away, hitting the cold stone wall behind the water heater. My mind was racing, trying to calculate the distance between us and the small rusted ventilation window at the back of the cellar. If I could distract him, if I could throw the box, I might have a chance. But Thomas wasn't looking at the box. He was looking at my eyes, reading my intent. "Put it down, Sarah," he said, stepping closer. "If you give it to me, I can make sure you're taken care of. You can go to the coast, start over, live a life that doesn't involve the mess your brother and mother left behind. But if you keep it, you aren't just an accomplice. You're a liability, and liabilities have a very short lifespan." "Why now?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Julian is in custody. The Service of Internal Security has the files. What does this ledger matter anymore?" Thomas laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Julian is an idiot. He was the front man, the one who took the risks, the one who attracted the attention. But the network? It's much larger than your brother. The ledger you're holding contains the names of the people who are currently protecting him in the holding facility. If those names get out, the entire structure of the local judiciary collapses. That, my dear, is why I have to ensure that neither you nor that book leaves this basement." He raised the weapon, leveling it at my heart. My vision tunneled. I looked down at the floor, seeing a heavy iron crowbar lying near the water heater, the one I'd used to pry the stone loose. My fingers brushed it, cold and rough, against the concrete. "I'm sorry, Sarah." Thomas sighed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You really were the only one of us with a conscience." As he moved to close the distance, I lunged not for the window, but for the water heater. I didn't swing the crowbar at him. I slammed it into the rusted, pressurized pipe that ran into the wall. A jet of scalding, high-pressure water exploded outward, filling the basement with a wall of steam and noise. Thomas shouted, blinded by the sudden spray, his shot going wild and shattering a stack of glass jars on the shelves behind me. I didn't wait for him to recover. I scrambled through the blinding fog of steam, my skin burning, and darted toward the basement stairs. I could hear him thrashing in the water, cursing, his footsteps heavy and uncoordinated. I hit the wooden steps, my boots slipping on the slick floor, and hauled myself toward the kitchen. I reached the top of the stairs, gasping for air, but as I turned to slam the door and lock it, a pair of hands grabbed my ankles. I was yanked backward, crashing down onto the wood, my face slamming into the sharp edge of the bottom stair. My vision sparked white, and for a moment the world dissolved into blackness. I felt someone looming over me, gripping my hair and forcing my head back. "You think a little water is going to stop me?" Thomas hissed, his face twisted in a mask of pure fury as he towered over me in the dim light. He reached for the lead-lined box that had slid across the floor, but then the front door of the house flew open. A flood of blinding light from high-powered tactical flashlights washed over the kitchen, followed by the deafening, rhythmic sound of boots on hardwood. A voice, amplified by a loudspeaker, boomed through the house. "Service of Internal Security! Drop the weapon and step away from the civilian!" Thomas froze, his eyes darting to the entrance. He looked down at me, his face a mix of terror and calculation, and then he pulled a device from his pocket and clicked a button. The entire floor of the house beneath us groaned and shifted. He had rigged the foundation. As the agent surged forward, the house began to tilt, the sound of splintering wood and collapsing earth filling the air. We were going down, and the entire structure was coming with us. The floorboards buckled like the hull of a ship hitting an iceberg. The world turned into a chaotic blur of drywall, screaming metal, and the deafening roar of the foundation, finally surrendering to the void beneath it. I didn't have time to scream. I simply curled into a ball, shielding the lead-lined box with my own body as the kitchen plunged downward. The darkness was absolute for a heartbeat, followed by the sickening crunch of wood against bedrock. When the dust settled, the only sound was the hiss of a ruptured gas line and the distant rhythmic thud of debris settling in the dark. I was buried under a wall of fallen cabinetry, the air thick with plaster dust that tasted like copper. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. My leg felt like it had been crushed by a falling beam, but the box, The box was still tucked securely against my chest. "Sarah?" The voice was distant, echoing through the hollow, ruined shell of the house. It wasn't Thomas. It was the lead agent from the lawyer's office. I tried to call out, but my throat was clogged with soot. I pounded my fist against the wreckage above me, the sound of metal ringing through the basement cavity. "Over here!" I finally managed to croak, the sound raw and desperate. Suddenly, a beam of light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the wreckage. I saw the flash of tactical gear, the sharp, authoritative movements of a rescue team. It felt like an eternity, but within minutes I was being pulled from the suffocating grip of the debris. As they carried me out into the crisp, cold night air, I looked back at the ruin that had been my childhood home. It was nothing more than a jagged, splintered crater in the earth. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. I watched as the agents combed the wreckage, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. One of them approached me, his expression softening as he saw the box I was clutching. "You're lucky to be alive, Miss Thorne," he said, gently taking the box from my hands. Thomas knew he couldn't get out with the evidence, so he decided to take the house down to bury the secret with us. But he underestimated the strength of the foundation he'd built his own lies upon. "Did he escape?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The agent shook his head. "He's trapped under the sub-basement. We've recovered him. He isn't going anywhere, and thanks to what you kept safe, he's never going to see the sun again." "The network is finished, Sarah. Every name in that ledger is being brought in as we speak. You didn't just save your life. You helped clear a cancer that had been eating this town from the inside out." The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions, protective custody, and the slow, painful process of healing. I learned that my mother hadn't just been a victim of circumstances. She had been a brilliant, desperate woman who had been feeding information to the Service of Internal Security for years, hoping that by the time I was old enough to understand, she would have cleared the path for me. She had been playing a long, dangerous game to ensure that when I finally inherited the house, the inheritance would be the freedom from the shadow of our family name. Julian, eventually, was sentenced to an enormous stretch of time for his role in the scheme. I didn't visit him. There was no closure to be found in his eyes, only the same cold greed that had nearly destroyed us both. I sold the plot of land where the house once stood, donating every cent of the proceeds to a hospice foundation, a final, quiet tribute to the years I spent caring for the woman who had fought so hard to protect me. I moved to a small town on the coast, a place where no one knew my name and no one cared about my family's history. I bought a small cottage with a garden, the kind of place where the only thing you have to worry about is the changing of the tides. One afternoon, exactly a year after the house collapsed, I sat on my porch, watching the waves roll in. The mail carrier dropped off a small, anonymous envelope. Inside was a single key, the same tarnished silver key from Mr. Henderson's office, and a note in my mother's elegant handwriting. It was a simple, final message. "The wait is gone. Now it is your turn to live. Don't look back." I held the key for a long moment, feeling the cold, smooth metal against my palm. I walked to the edge of the dunes, where the sand met the deep, endless blue of the ocean. With a flick of my wrist, I cast the key into the surf. It disappeared without a splash, swallowed by the vastness of the water. I turned my back on the ocean and started walking toward my house. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the garden. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I was just Sarah, and for the first time, the future belonged entirely to me. The ghosts were buried, the secrets were silenced, And as I stepped through my front door, I finally felt the silence of a life truly my own. I closed the door, locked it, and didn't look back.